Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Nordenberg. I am the former chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh and currently have the honor of serving as both chair of its Institute of Politics and director of its Dick Thornburgh Forum for Law and Public Policy. It is a real pleasure for me to welcome you to this 2022 American Distinguished Experience Lecture, which will be delivered by Congressman Mike Doyle. And I extend those greetings on behalf of not only the IOP and the Thornburgh Forum, but also the Honors College of the university. The American Distinguished Speakers Series is the University of Pittsburgh's longest running speaker series. We celebrated its golden anniversary about 2 years ago. I'm sure it will not surprise you when I say that the first 49 of those lectures were delivered live and in person. Then, of course, the pandemic interceded. In 2020, the late Dr. Larry E. Davis delivered the series' first remote lecture. Larry was the former dean of our School of Social Work and the founding director of our Center on Race and Social Problems. He also was one of the country's most highly respected scholars of race and had a distinctively inviting touch when it came to raising difficult issues in ways that led people to want to discuss him. His lecture, Will Race Always Matter, was delivered just a few months after the killing of George Floyd. And we had no way of knowing that just a few months after that, Larry would pass away, making that his final lecture. In 2021, Ambassador Robert Zoellick appeared, again remotely, to discuss the place of America in the world, tied to his sweeping history of American diplomacy from the Revolutionary War to the present. Bob approached that topic with a wealth of valuable background, having served among many other important positions as Deputy Chief of Staff in the White House, Undersecretary of State, Ambassador and U.S. Trade Representative, and President of the World Bank. We could only wonder what he might say about the place of America in the world today, given the upending of the world order by the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Today, though, we have an opportunity to learn about a critically important domestic topic, infrastructure, from one of Western Pennsylvania's favorite sons, Congressman Mike Doyle. Mike was first elected to Congress in 1994 and then was elected 13 additional times. He is the dean of Pennsylvania's congressional delegation, but last fall made the announcement that he would not seek re-election to Congress this year, feeling as if it was time to pass the torch. At that time, Pittsburgh Mayor Bill Peduto described him as a model of public service who had led our region through financial hardship, pivoting economies, new technologies, and a global pandemic. Allegheny County Executive Rich Fitzgerald also credited the congressman with being a major force in the transformation and revitalization of the region, and said more personally that without his mentoring, leadership, and friendship, I would not be the county executive today. His influence was that great, and his retirement will leave a large void at all levels, which will be difficult to fill. Some registrants for this program, too, decided that rather than submitting questions, they would submit their own statements of respect and affection for the congressman, along with their disappointment that he would be leaving office. One attested to her admiration for him and continued by saying, "I've long said I'm loyal to Doyle," and wanted to propose that phrase for a campaign slogan, "But you retired." What then followed was the written version of Weeping and Wailing. Speaking more personally, I always have believed that good leadership starts with being a good person. And as one who first got to know the congressman when we would occasionally stop our carts long enough to chat while shopping in the Edgewood Town Center Giant Eagle, I can attest to the fact that Mike Doyle is a fine person, unpretentious, hardworking, smart, and completely committed to advancing the greater good. In discussing his own career, the congressman has said, "The way you get things done is when you work together and push in the same direction." And I think that's been a part of Pittsburgh's success story. Though he acknowledged that all boats had not risen to the same level. And rather than simply accepting the praise that came his way when he announced his retirement, he deflected it back to his constituents, saying, "I want to thank the people of Pittsburgh, the best people in the world, for giving me the chance to serve you in Congress over these many years. It's truly been a joy as well as an honor and privilege to have the chance to serve this community, which I love from the bottom of my heart." His service has included being founder and co-chair of the Congressional Autism Caucus, co-founder and chair of the House Robotics Caucus, and co-founder and co-chair of the House Distributed Generation Caucus, which works to promote the widespread adoption of decentralized power generation technology that is both fuel efficient and environmentally friendly and reduces peak demands on the country's overutilized electricity transmission grid. He also is a member of the Steel, Human Rights, and Internet caucuses. Most directly relevant, the Congress is a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee and chairs its Communications and Technology Subcommittee. I'm very pleased that Mike Doyle is here today to talk about everything from bridges, and yes, the Fern Hollow Bridge is in his district, to broadband, which squarely fits within the jurisdiction of the subcommittee that he chairs. Congressman, welcome to the American Experience Distinguished Speaker Series, and the floor is yours.
Well, Mark, thank you very much for that rather lengthy but kind words. I appreciate it. And I want to thank you and Pitt's Institute of Politics for inviting me to make this afternoon's presentation. It's an honor to be asked to deliver this American Experience lecture. Mark asked me to speak this afternoon about one of the most important issues facing our country, although it's usually not one of the flashiest or widely covered issues. While issues such as voting rights, healthcare, and inflation are all critically important and controversial public policy issues today, Mark asked me to talk about an issue on which Congress recently took significant bipartisan action: infrastructure. It may not be the top story on the evening news every night, as it was briefly after the collapse of the Fern Hollow Bridge here in Pittsburgh, but infrastructure, or public works as it used to be called, is literally the foundation on which the rest of our economy is based. Moreover, infrastructure has the undesirable characteristic of being what economists refer to frequently as a public good, something which in many, probably most cases, provides important benefits to our society, but which the free market tends to underprovide. Hence, infrastructure has historically been the responsibility of government. And as the Fern Hollow Bridge dramatically illustrated, our nation has short-sightedly failed to adequately invest in its infrastructure in recent decades. That's the case I'm going to make this afternoon for you. And then I'll talk about how the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which Congress just approved on a bipartisan basis, will help to make up for that underinvestment in the coming years. But let me start by going back to Pittsburgh's founding. I think it's fair to say that the city of Pittsburgh, as we know it exists, is a result of its location at the confluence of the Allegheny, Monongahela, and Ohio rivers, essentially three natural superhighways in a mountainous, heavily forested region. The strategic importance of this location was recognized both by the British and the French during the 7 Years' War, and they competed to control it. Consequently, the first man-made infrastructure of national significance that was built in this region, excluding actual fortifications, consisted of Braddock's Road and Forbes Road, both of which were built by the British and colonial troops in the 1750s, and both of which subsequently served as major transportation corridors through the Appalachian Mountains for land-hungry settlers in the following decades. A civilian community took root at the confluence of the three rivers and grew rapidly in the following decades, from 300 people in 1761 to 1,500 in 1800 and 7,000 by 1820. The first local government was established in 1771, and a town plan was drafted and approved in 1784. Pittsburgh was incorporated as a borough in 1794 and chartered as a city in 1816. Pittsburgh's first major industry was building boats for settlers traveling down the Ohio River, soon followed by iron production and glass manufacturing. By 1816, Pittsburgh was manufacturing pianos, textiles, steam engines, tin and brass, as well as boats, iron and glass. Roads and rivers remained the dominant means of transportation in Western Pennsylvania through the first decades of the Republic. But other infrastructure began to be built as well. Municipal leaders authorized the construction of 4 wells on Market Street in 1802 to provide water for drinking and fighting fires. The first bridge in Pittsburgh opened in 1818, and the city built a pumping system and reservoir to provide drinking water from the Allegheny River in 1828. In the 1830s, in response to the perceived economic threat posed to our region by New York's Erie Canal, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania built the Pennsylvania Canal between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. That canal was a wonder of engineering that helped open up Western Pennsylvania, transporting passengers and millions of pounds of goods each year by 1834. It reduced travel time from one end of Pennsylvania to the other from 21 days to less than 4 days. And at their peak, there were more than 1,200 miles of canals in Pennsylvania. But the canals couldn't compete with the railroads, which also began commercial operations in the 1830s. Rail service between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, provided by a private company, began in 1855. The trip from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh took less than a day by train. The canal was sold to the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1857, which operated it at a loss for several months and then shut down much of it. In 1858, it became possible to travel by rail from Philadelphia through Pittsburgh to Chicago. And the following decades saw an explosion of railroad building into and out of Pittsburgh by private companies. And before 1900, Pittsburgh was tightly connected to the rest of the country by a seamless network of railroads. But railroads still faced competition from the rivers. Even as railroads expanded across the country, steamboats jammed our rivers, transporting goods and passengers. But you know, river travel, while relatively inexpensive, was very dangerous. Rocks, sandbars, and rapids were plentiful in the three rivers, and some stretches were quite shallow, especially at particular times of the year. As you might expect, after the construction of the Pennsylvania Canal, there was great interest in improving our nation's navigable waters. The first lock and dam in our region was built in 1841 on the Monongahela River by a private company, and other locks and dams soon followed suit, providing cheap, reliable transportation for coal mined upriver and making Pittsburgh's rise as the iron and steel making capital of the world possible. The Army Corps of Engineers bought the Mon locks and dams in 1897 and began a major improvements in the following decades. Today, those rivers still provide an essential transportation option for our local economy, particularly for bulky, heavy commodities. The Port of Pittsburgh consists of 200 miles of navigable waterways in the surrounding 12 counties, over which more than 50 million tons of goods move each year, and which support more than 70,000 local jobs. That important economic activity wouldn't be possible, however, without the locks and dams that make barge traffic possible. Now, the locks and dams that were built by the Corps in the early 1900s exceeded their projected lifespans many years ago, however. So consequently, I've worked with the region's congressional delegation and the Corps of Engineers to repair and replace these locks. As a result, several of the most at-risk facilities have been repaired or replaced in recent years, specifically the Emsworth Lock and Dams on the Ohio River and Lock and Dams 2, 3, and 4 along the Monongahela River. But the Montgomery locks and dams currently face a 50% chance of failure by 2028, according to the Port of Pittsburgh Commission. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. You know, our waterways weren't the only highways, however. For several hundred years, they served as our water supply and our sewers. And yes, that is absolutely as problematic and disturbing as it sounds. Pittsburgh was hit by a number of devastating epidemics in the 19th century. In 1822, 1823, and 1849, major cholera outbreaks struck Pittsburgh. More than 1,000 Pittsburghers died from cholera in the summer of 1849 alone. In the late 19th century, hundreds of Pittsburghers died each year from typhoid fever, and the city developed a reputation as less healthy than its peers. In fact, it had a higher mortality rate for typhoid fever than any other city in the United States. And the culprit was believed to be impure drinking water. Well, the water here was certainly impure. Just after the turn of the century, one study concluded that more than 300,000 people upstream from Pittsburgh dumped their sewage into our rivers. So Pittsburgh built its first water filtration and treatment plant in 1908 and began chlorinating its drinking water in 1911. Immediately afterwards, the city's death rate from typhoid dropped by roughly 80%. The city's water treatment system was expanded incrementally in subsequent decades, and a new generation of water treatment and filtration was adopted in the 1960s. And speaking of sewage, Pittsburgh too was dumping its residential and industrial waste into the rivers. You know, the city built its first sewer system in 1840 to serve Shadyside and Oakland. And in the following decades, the city's sewer system was expanded. It included more than 200 miles of underground sewers in 1898 and just under 400 miles in 1908. But needless to say, all of this untreated household and industrial waste still ended up in our rivers. In 1910, State Health Commissioner urged Pittsburgh to start treating its sewage and create separate sewer systems for stormwater and wastewater. In fact, Pittsburgh began considering a sewage treatment system at about the same time as it began considering drinking water treatment. In 1912, however, after several studies concluded that the city couldn't afford to build a sewage treatment plant facility, plans to build a sewage treatment plant were shelved indefinitely. Instead, the city determined to build several water storage reservoirs so that it could essentially flush its sewage downstream during droughts. And it continued to build combined waste and stormwater systems. Pittsburgh only undertook efforts to treat its sewage after the Commonwealth passed a law in 1945 that required municipalities in Allegheny County to stop polluting the streams of the state. The next year, the Allegheny County Sanitary Authority was formed, and work began on a treatment plant and a systems of pipes to connect it to the existing sewers. The new plant began operation in May of 1959, more than 50 years after the concept had first been discussed. But as I'm sure you all know, Pittsburgh's problems with discharge of untreated sewage still exist today. As I mentioned earlier, more than 100 years ago, the city's leaders decided that treating the city's sewage and building separate source systems for wastewater and stormwater would cost a prohibitive amount. But you know what they say about the sins of the fathers. In 1972, the Clean Water Act outlawed combined sanitary source system overflows. And in 1997, the Justice Department and the EPA finally came calling. After a lot of legal wrangling, Alcosan entered into a consent decree with the federal government in 2008, modified in 2020, which committed it to eliminating its SSOs and reducing its CSOs by 7 billion gallons a year. That effort is estimated to cost roughly $2 billion. Alcosan customers have seen their rates rise significantly already, and will see them rise significantly more if the state and federal governments don't come to their rescue. Now, as many of you know, I've been working with local leaders to secure federal aid for this massive infrastructure investment, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later. Last, but certainly not least, I want to circle back to transportation in our region. You know, at the beginning of my remarks, I mentioned Braddock and Forbes Road and the important role they played in opening up our region to settlement. Then I talked about how canals, our navigable rivers and railroads dominated transportation sectors in the 19th century. But two big technological changes took place in our society at the end of the 19th century: electricity and the internal combustion engine. Electricity lit up our cities and powered factories and homes. It also powered trolleys, which became ubiquitous in America and enabled the first burst of suburban development around our nation's cities. Now, the trolleys are gone, but Allegheny County still has mass transit in the form of buses and light rail, and they still provide essential transportation services throughout our region and relieve some of the congestion and delay on our roads. I'm pleased to note that during my service in Congress, I was able to help secure federal funding for the Stage 2 light rail project for the South Hills LRT, as well as the construction of the North Shore Connector, which expanded our light rail system. I'm also very proud that I was able to help secure funding for reconstruction of the East Liberty Multimodal Transfer Facility and for the purchase of cleaner buses and the expansion of the Martin Luther King Jr. East Busway. It's my hope that Allegheny County will be able to continue to expand and improve its light rail and dedicated busway systems in the coming years. Of course, as you all know, the widespread adoption of the automobile led to increased mobility for millions of Americans and put pressure on government at all levels to build and improve the nation's roads. And Pittsburgh was no exception to this trend. Our region saw a burst of road building activity between the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II, culminating in the opening of the first section of the Pennsylvania Turnpike, America's first superhighway, in 1940. Road construction surged again in the 50s and 60s with the construction of the interstate highway system, and the turnpike was extended from Irwin to the Ohio state line in 1951. Today, we still see our highways expanding, although much more slowly, in the form of the Southern Beltway and the Monfayette Expressway, paid for by the Commonwealth's oil franchise tax, administered by the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission, and authorized by Act 61, which was approved 37 years ago. Needless to say, a lot of people have had second thoughts about the interstate highway system in the decades since the 50s. And clearly a number of bad decisions were made, including locally, such as the construction of I-579 between the Hill District and downtown, and the construction of Route 65 through Manchester. I've worked with state and local leaders to right those wrongs by reconnecting the Hill District with downtown, for example, but more still needs to be done. Finally, I want to touch on the most recent addition to our transportation mix, aviation. The Wright brothers first flew in 1903. But commercial aviation really didn't get started until the 1920s, driven in large part by the technological developments of World War I and by the surplus aircraft that were available and inexpensive after the war's end. The first major airfield in our region was established in West Mifflin in 1925 by local investors. It was nothing more than a grassy field, but it was good enough to host air shows, sell airplane rides, and give flying lessons. And that same year, the newly formed Clifford Ball Airline won the first private contract to deliver mail and begin using the field for its Pittsburgh to Cleveland route. 1931, the Allegheny County Airport opened a mile to the west. And at that time, it was the third largest airport in the country and the nation's only hard surface airport. But pretty soon it was considered too small to meet the region's growing needs. In 1940, shortly before US entry into World War II, the county and federal governments began work on a new airfield in Moon Township. Initially, it was intended solely as a military facility, but commercial passenger operations were approved near the war's end, the terminal was opened, and commercial flights from Greater Pittsburgh Airport began in 1952. At that time, the airport terminal was the largest in the United States. Now, I'm sure you're all acquainted with the more recent history of the airport, how in 1987, in collaboration with US Air, the airport began a $1 billion construction effort intended to facilitate, the airline's use of Pittsburgh as its main hub. Thank you. That work was completed in 1992, and the airport handled almost 21 million passengers. Unfortunately, by 2005, US Airways had shifted much of its operations to airports in Philadelphia and Charlotte, leaving Pittsburgh with a huge, tremendously oversized terminal. Since then, a number of other carriers have started operating out of Pittsburgh International Airport, and the airport's air cargo operations have increased significantly. In addition, the Pennsylvania congressional delegation has been successful in fighting efforts to reduce the US military presence at the airport during past base realignment proceedings. And we have succeeded in securing the infrastructure improvements necessary to enable continued use of the airfield by the 911th Air Refueling Wing for years to come. Allegheny County is currently in the process of a $1.5 billion modernization of Pittsburgh International's passenger terminal to reshape it to meet the needs of southwestern Pennsylvania rather than those of a single airline. Pittsburgh International Airport is also building a new cargo warehouse that will be able to accommodate specialty goods like pharmaceuticals and medical supplies that have to be kept at certain temperatures. So I think it's safe to say that Pittsburgh International Airport has made it through some challenging times and is poised for a promising future. That's a brief overview of our region's infrastructure development history. I hope I've managed to convey to you the size and scope of the infrastructure investments that were necessary to transform Pittsburgh from a tiny frontier settlement into a major metropolitan area and economic powerhouse it is today. I'd also like to point out that the vast majority of that investment was publicly funded. And I hope I've also managed to get across how long ago many of those investments were made, because that brings me to two key points I want to make. First, it's important to understand that many of our public works are simply worn out. They're crumbling away before our eyes and are in desperate need of repair, and in many cases, replacement. We all saw that quite clearly last month when the Fern Hollow Bridge collapsed, and decades ago when chunks of the Greenfield Bridge broke off and fell onto people in their cars. That's currently the case with the Montgomery locks and dams on the Ohio River, which is more than 80 years old and at risk of catastrophic failure. And that brings me to my second point. It's important to understand that we have, as a nation, have failed to adequately invest in our current and future needs for decades. Think about it. After a burst of infrastructure investment back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we as a nation throttled back and started coasting. We've even failed to adequately address routine wear and tear. The last time we even raised the gas tax federally was in 1993, nearly 30 years ago. It's no wonder that today we face a crisis of our own making. I hope it's also clear to you that our future growth will be limited by the infrastructure that's available to support it. Building the right infrastructure will promote economic growth, and the failure to do so will lead to stagnation and decline. The American Society of Civil Engineers has been issuing report cards that highlight our nation's infrastructure shortcomings for more than 20 years. In their 2021 report card for America's infrastructure, it gave the United States an overall grade of C-. The Society gave Pennsylvania a C- grade on our latest infrastructure report card, including Ds on our transit, waterway, stormwater, and drinking water infrastructure, and a D- on our wastewater infrastructure. On the bright side, we got D+ on our roads and bridges. That report concluded that there are 3,300 bridges and more than 7,500 miles of highway in Pennsylvania that are in poor condition. Commute times have increased by 7.6% in Pennsylvania since 2011. Each driver in Pennsylvania pays an average of $600 a year in auto maintenance costs caused by driving on roads in need of repair. The nation faces a huge transit infrastructure repair backlog, and Pennsylvania is no exception. 25% of the transit vehicles in the state have exceeded their useful life, including the Port Authority of Allegheny County, which has some light rail cars that have exceeded their 35-year design lifespan. Pennsylvania's aging drinking water mains are breaking more frequently, and many housing units, schools, and child care centers in Pennsylvania lack safe drinking water. Nearly 1 out of every 7 Pennsylvania households lacks a home internet connection, and at least 400,000 Pennsylvanians live in areas where, under the FCC's current benchmark standard, there's no broadband service. I hope you'll agree with me that significant new investments in our nation's infrastructure are desperately needed. Well, I've got some good news for you. Congress passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act with my support last year, and the president signed it into law. This is a $1.2 trillion bill, which will make unprecedented investments to improve our nation's most visible physical infrastructures, such as roads, bridges, and airport, but also elements of our infrastructure that don't get as much attention, but are equally as important, such as the electrical grid, water systems, cybersecurity, and broadband infrastructure. I believe we need to keep these investments to rebuild our economy and keep America competitive on the world stage. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act will make life better for all Pennsylvanians, help curb climate change, promote economic growth, and create high-paying construction jobs in Pennsylvania and across the country. These investments are desperately needed to fix and modernize our outdated, crumbling infrastructure. I've been saying for years that we should invest more in our country's infrastructure, and I'm pleased to see that Congress has finally done so with President Biden's leadership. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was approved by a bipartisan majority in both the House and the Senate, and I think that it proves that our government can still get big things done. I want to take this opportunity to discuss the major provisions of this bill and how they benefit both our nation and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I want to start by talking about parts of this landmark legislation that I had an active part in writing. I worked hard to make sure that the broadband provisions made it into the final bill. For example, we have funded once-in-a-generation program that puts us on the path to 100% connectivity by putting $42 billion towards to connect areas that lack access to broadband. There are also many families that have access to broadband, but struggle to afford it. So we've included money to support those individuals, families who previously couldn't afford to get online and will now have access to the online tools that their peers do. The bill also includes $16 billion for capping abandoned mines and oil and gas wells. With a disproportionate share of the nation's abandoned mines, Pennsylvania will get a disproportionate share of this money. We're going to get nearly $3.8 billion, in fact, more than any other state in the country. This will really help to improve our region's environment, but it also will put people, including in the oil and gas industry, back to work. I was also successful in working to provide $6 billion in the bill to spur U.S. advanced battery processing, manufacturing, and recycling, creating good-paying American jobs and enabling American manufacturers to prosper in the 21st century. Today, the U.S. relies heavily on importing advanced battery components from abroad. As a matter of economic and national security, we should be focusing on bringing critical manufacturing like that back home. While American industry is already the cleanest in the world and the most innovative, there is a tremendous opportunity for us to be world leaders in zero carbon manufacturing, and clean hydrogen can accelerate the transition to a zero carbon industry. That's why I've worked hard to include over $8 billion for research into bringing down the cost of clean hydrogen and for the creation of regional hydrogen hubs that connect producers and end users of hydrogen in order to make U.S. industry the leaders in a clean future. I believe that Southwestern Pennsylvania can be a major player in both clean hydrogen and advanced battery manufacturing, and that doing so would help boost our region's economy in the years ahead. Now let me talk about the major provisions in the new bipartisan infrastructure law. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act authorizes $1.2 trillion in infrastructure investments over the next 8 years. That's an increase of roughly $550 billion over current spending levels, including $110 billion for roads and bridges, $46 billion for public transit, including $7 billion for low-emission buses and ferries, $7.5 billion for electric vehicle charging stations, $66 billion for passenger and freight rail, $17 billion for ports and waterways, $25 billion for airports, $55 billion for drinking and wastewater infrastructure, $73 billion to modernize the nation's electricity transmission grid, $65 billion to expand broadband internet coverage to all Americans, $50 billion for climate resiliency projects, and $21 billion for environmental remediation projects. It is estimated that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act will create over 2 million jobs each year for the next decade. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act will invest $110 billion of new funding in our roads and bridges, $40 billion of which will fund bridge repair, replacement, and rehabilitation. This is the single largest dedicated bridge investment since the construction of the interstate highway system. And Pennsylvania can expect to receive at least $11.3 billion for federal aid highway apportion programs and $1.6 billion for bridge replacement and repairs. That breaks down to roughly $400 million for our region. And we can really use it too, with such important local needs as eliminating the bottleneck at Bates Street and the East Parkway to better serve the new Hazelwood Green redevelopment initiative, reconnecting Manchester with the river where it's been cut off by Route 65, and making improvements in our local highways that haven't been properly maintained. The McKees Rocks Bridge, which is more than 60 years old, and the Commercial Street and Fraser Street bridges on the Parkway East, all were in desperate need of work. U.S. public transit systems collectively face a multi-billion-dollar repair backlog consisting of more than 24,000 buses, 5,000 rail cars, 200 stations, and thousands of miles of track, signals, and power systems in need of replacement. This deferred maintenance can cause public transit to be unreliable and discourage ridership, causing more vehicular traffic and pollution, as well as damaging our economy. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act makes the largest federal investment in America's public transit system ever. The legislation provides $89.9 billion in guaranteed funding for public transit over the next 5 years, including $39 billion of new investment to modernize transit fleets and improve accessibility for the elderly and people with disabilities. Pennsylvania can expect to receive $2.8 billion in funding for transit from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act over the next 5 years. One of our region's top priorities for that money is extending the Martin Luther King Jr. East Busway from its current terminus at Rankin and Swissvale down to the Turtle Creek and Mon Valley. And the Port Authority's next transit plan envisions extending it at a future point all the way to McKeesport or Monroeville. That would really help connect people in those communities with job opportunities downtown. Another top regional priority is a new transit line connecting the Strip District with Overbrook by way of the Hill District, Oakland, and Hazelwood. It is possible that one or both of these projects could receive funding under this new infrastructure law. The Port Authority will also probably receive funding to replace older rolling stock and high pollution buses. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act invests $66 billion in passenger rail. That's the largest investment in Amtrak since its creation 50 years ago. This funding will be used to eliminate Amtrak's maintenance backlog, modernize the Northeast Corridor, and bring world-class passenger rail service to areas outside the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions. Plans call for adding another round trip from Pittsburgh to New York with part of that funding. American airports lag far behind their competitors globally, and no US airport ranks in the top 20 airports worldwide. This puts our economy at a competitive disadvantage and negatively affects our supply chains and ability to trade with strategic partners. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act would spend $25 billion to improve airport terminals, runways, gates, taxiways, and air traffic control towers. Pennsylvania can expect to receive at least $355 million through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act for its airports over the next 5 years. And in fact, the Commonwealth has already received $70 million for its airports, with Pittsburgh International Airport receiving $11 million on top of the $36 million it received in COVID relief funding last year, and with the Allegheny County Airport receiving $750,000. With regards to water infrastructure, the Biden administration announced recently where the Army Corps of Engineers will invest $14 billion across the nation. These 500 new investments won't just strengthen key water infrastructure sites, improve resiliency to the climate crisis, and restore the environment. They'll also create jobs and economic growth. Most notably, that funding includes $857 million to complete construction work at the Montgomery Lock and Dam on the Ohio River, which is a critical link on our region's waterway. The Montgomery Lock and Dam is more than 80 years old and is in dire need of replacement. The Port of Pittsburgh has stated that the Montgomery Lock and Dam currently faces a 50% chance of catastrophic failure by 2028. Such a disaster would shut down commerce on the Ohio at that point, with serious repercussions for our region's economy. I've been working for years with other members of our congressional delegation to secure funding to replace this facility, and I'm very pleased that the Biden administration has allocated all of the funding necessary from the money provided by this new infrastructure law. In addition, the new infrastructure law will provide $77 million to build 2 new locks at Emsworth Locks and Dams, a much needed upgrade to a facility originally built in the 1920s. And as I suggested earlier, our local waterways aren't just important for transportation options they provide. They're also essential for meeting Pittsburgh's other water-related needs, such as drinking water, recreation, and environmental preservation. Currently, up to 10 million American households and 400,000 schools lack safe drinking water. Pittsburgh's come a long way in terms of reducing lead levels in its drinking water, but the effort to get the lead out isn't over yet, locally or nationally. In addition, Allegheny County still faces a massive challenge in reducing the 9 billion gallons of untreated sewage that it discharges into the local waterways each year. It should come as no surprise then that a recently released report from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection concluded that a third of the Commonwealth's rivers and streams fail to meet water quality standards for recreation, consuming fish, or supporting aquatic wildlife. Even if that's acceptable, which it's not, It's not sustainable. We need to take better care of our natural environment for a number of reasons that I don't think I need to enumerate. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act will provide $55 billion for water infrastructure, including $15 billion to remove lead pipes and $200 million to address lead in school drinking water. That's the largest investment in clean drinking water and wastewater infrastructure in American history. Pennsylvania can expect to receive $1.4 billion over the next 5 years to improve water infrastructure across the state. And the Commonwealth has already received $3 million through the new infrastructure bill. That money will be used for work in the Spring Gardens shore shed. As I mentioned earlier, Pennsylvania can expect $1.4 billion over the next 5 years for water infrastructure. But with nearly $2 billion improvements by Alcosan required under the consent decree, and with customer rates already doubled and projected to double again, I believe the federal government needs to do more to help local governments like ours bring their water and sewer systems into compliance with our national water quality standards. And I'll talk about a little more about that in 1 minute. I believe the COVID pandemic proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that high-speed internet access is not a luxury today. Broadband is necessary for Americans to do their jobs, participate fully in school, and access healthcare. Despite this, more than 19 million people, or 6% of the US population, lack access to reliable, affordable broadband internet service. And this just isn't a problem in rural areas, where a huge investment in broadband infrastructure is needed to connect homes and businesses to the internet. More than 4 million people who lack access to the internet service live in urban and suburban regions of the country also. So, as chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee's Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, I helped draft the broadband provisions of the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act and fought to make sure they were included in this bill. This legislation invests $65 billion to help ensure every American has access to reliable high-speed internet. Pennsylvania can expect at least $100 million over the next 5 years to help expand broadband coverage to nearly 400,000 Pennsylvanians who currently lack access to it. In addition, the new infrastructure law builds on the broadband investments made through the American Rescue Plan to help nearly 3 million low-income Pennsylvanians, 23% of our state's population, afford broadband service through the Affordable Connectivity Benefit. The bill also established a broadband nutrition label, which will help families comparison shop for a better deal. The Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act includes the single largest investment in clean energy transmission in American history. It invests in research and development for advanced transmission and electricity distribution technologies, promotes smart grid technologies, and upgrades to our power grid by building thousands of miles of new resilient transmission lines to facilitate the expansion of renewable energy. It also invests in demonstration projects and research hubs for the next generation technologies like advanced nuclear, carbon capture, and clean hydrogen. In addition, it establishes the first ever national network of electric vehicle chargers in the United States, allowing EV chargers along highway corridors to facilitate long distance travel within communities to provide convenient charging where electric vehicles are often parked. Pennsylvania can expect $171 million over the next 5 years to expand EV charging networks across the Commonwealth. Pennsylvanians are also going to benefit from the bill's historic $3.5 billion investment in weatherization, which will reduce energy costs for millions of families. And finally, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act included important investments in environmental remediation and climate resiliency. I don't need to tell anyone listening that there's still environmental remediation to be done here in our region. There's the old Coke plant on Neville Island, for example, and a number of sites in the Mon Valley. And we've seen more flooding recently in our region, partly as a result of climate change. And even if you still don't believe in the climate crisis, I think we can all agree that additional investment in resiliency with regards to national disasters is worthwhile and in fact cost effective. Most Americans see pictures of floods and wildfires on the evening news, and they're concerned for their fellow Americans. But what they might not realize is the tremendous cost we all bear after such events. The United States has experienced 145 extreme weather events between 2010 and 2020, for example, and many in those 10 years as in the preceding 20. And those tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and other extreme weather events has caused nearly $1 trillion in damages. Pennsylvania experienced 37 extreme weather events between 2010 and 2020, costing the state an estimated $10 billion in damages. This new infrastructure law provides $21 billion for environmental remediation projects, $50 billion for climate resiliency projects, including $49 million over 5 years for Pennsylvania to protect against wildfire. You add it all up, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act roughly doubled the level of federal investment in our nation's infrastructure over the next 5 years. So I think you can see why, with such a substantial investment in our nation's future, I'm proud to have voted in favor of this landmark legislation. But here's the problem, and it's the message I want to leave you with. While the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was a good start, it nevertheless falls short of where we need to be. While Pennsylvania will receive roughly $13 billion for roads and bridges over the next 5 years under this bill, that eliminates only about a third of PennDOT's estimated funding gap of $40 billion over that period of time. And while Pennsylvania will receive $1.4 billion over the next 5 years under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to address water and sewage issues, that will eliminate only about a tenth of Pennsylvania's $16.8 billion drinking water investment gap, according to the EPA's most recent drinking water needs survey. The Elkasan consent decree alone is expected to cost $2 billion. So to put it bluntly, we've underfunded our nation's infrastructure so much over the last 20 or 30 years that even $500 billion in increased investment won't eliminate the backlog. I think it's inexcusable, but then again, I've been calling for increased infrastructure investment and the taxes needed to pay for it for years. And let me tell you, it's been a pretty lonely position to take. Anyone who's watched the 2021 debate over this infrastructure bill with any degree of attention would agree, I think it was like pulling teeth to get this bill passed. If you'll recall, President Biden came to Pittsburgh last spring to propose a $2 trillion investment in our nation's infrastructure. After more than 6 months of negotiations, compromises, and cuts, Congress approved the bill that was only about 60% as big as the president's initial proposal. I think a strong argument can be made that level of spending was too low. I think it's fair to say Congress has been working or fighting on an infrastructure bill for the last 5 years or so. It shouldn't be so hard to enact a bill that makes so much sense. Unfortunately, like so many other issues in Washington today, infrastructure has become politically polarized as well, with one of our two major parties in Congress under tremendous pressure to oppose major infrastructure investments. Now, I'm not going to wade into politics of the issue tonight, however. What I am going to say tonight is that our region's future and our nation's depends in no small part on whether we make the necessary investments now to ensure a prosperous future for us all. Because as sure as my name is Michael Francis Doyle, the failure to adequately invest in our future infrastructure needs will doom our society and this community to decline and dissatisfaction in the long run. Conversely, more investment will lead to better outcomes for this community. I also want to make clear that there's no free lunch, as they say. There's no escaping the fact that we've got to put some money down. That probably means raising taxes to pay for more infrastructure spending. The definition of investment is committing money today in the expectation of receiving a larger return in the future. I firmly believe that the down payment we will make on our future prosperity will be worth it. And I hope that you all do too. And with that, let me stop and take some questions, Mark.
Thank you very much, Michael Francis Doyle. I'm sure you've taken most of us from a position where we knew there was a big dollar infrastructure bill that had been passed. but we're far less clear on what some of the impacts would be. So that's a real contribution to all of us. Let me start with your last point, and that is we need to invest today so that we can have better tomorrows. How long do you think it will be before the citizens of Pennsylvania and the country can see some of the benefits of these investments, which likely will help with the selling that may be required down the road?
Yeah, well, the funding is over a 5-year period. And I think over these 5 years, you're going to see a lot of construction going on. There'll be some headaches with that as the construction goes on, but I think people need to see where their money's going. If they can see improvements in the infrastructure, if they see that some of the traffic jams are being abated, if they see areas of the country where they didn't have access to broadband, all of a sudden they now start to have access to broadband. Once they see those things happening, I think they realize that, you know, the money is going as it's intended, and it's benefiting the country. You know, I always said infrastructure is not, there's no Republican or Democratic roads, you know, and infrastructure doesn't fix itself, and it doesn't get cheaper the longer you don't fix it. And so here we are basically ignoring infrastructure investments for the past 20, 30 years. And we've got this tremendous backlog. And even with this historic investment that we're making in our infrastructure, we still aren't going to be able to take all of the backlog up. I think the other thing, Mark, too, is we have to find a better funding formula for how we're going to do this. You know, the gasoline tax, I mean, imagine trying to pass a gasoline tax right now with gasoline $4 a gallon because of other factors going on in the world. It would be virtually impossible. No politician, in fact, they're talking about undoing the gasoline tax, which would take money out of the highway trust fund. We're moving to electric cars too. Detroit's given us a signal. By 2035, they're just making electric cars. So, you know, how are we going to do that? I think we need a new formula that isn't based on gasoline, but maybe based on miles driven, or another way to compute how people will pay, you know, taxes to support the infrastructure. And report after report shows what happens to vehicles that are driving on roads that are in need of repair. They're spending, Americans on average, $600 a year repairing their vehicles from bad roads. So when people start to see the roads get better and the bridges get repaired and are safer, and broadband start to be deployed and electric charging stations out there, when all of this starts to become a reality, my hope is that they see this as a good investment and they continue to support future investments, because I think it's important.
You said that there were some projects that had a chance of being funded through the dollars that will be available under this act. Are there processes in place for the distribution of dollars, and at what levels of government do those processes exist?
So there's a lot of formula money that's going to come down to the states. And then there'll be application processes for that. There's also going to be application processes federally. The best example I can give you most recently was the Tiger grant that we finally got after 4 years of battling for one, that's connecting downtown Pittsburgh to the lower hill by putting a cap and a park over 579. You know, another project that we've been looking at is reconnecting Manchester to the river that got split away by Route 65. These are projects that they can apply. There's grant programs that they can apply. They're very competitive, but we now have a lot of dollars in these programs. And one of the things that I've been able to do during my tenure in Congress is, you know, I believe our congressional district got 4 Tiger grants. There's many congressional districts that are still looking for their first one. But the point I made is this thing of working together. I think our success in getting those grants was we picked one critical project at a time. We identified what's the most important need right now that is eligible for these kinds of fund. And we got everybody behind it. We had the support of our state delegation. We had the support of the mayor. We had the support of the county executive. We had the support of city council, and we lobbied hard with the Department of Transportation. And we weren't successful the first couple grant years, but when we didn't get the grant, we had meetings, briefings afterwards to find out where our proposal went short, and we stayed at it. And there's going to be a lot of money, like I said, over the 5 years of programs like this, where we can start to address some of these programs. Think about Hazelwood Green and the potential that exists down there, and the development that we're going to start to see. And then think about, how do you get to Hazelwood Green? Well, there's no entrance off the Parkway, right? And we all know what Bates Street looks like, and 2nd Avenue. I mean, there's a project that I believe, needs to get done too. And it's beyond the scope of local and state governments to do projects like that. That's where this funding is going to come in.
Do you view the passage of this act as the glass half full or the glass half empty?
Well,
you did refer to it as bipartisan, but it was barely bipartisan. Really.
Yeah. Well, look, it's funny, whether you voted for it or not. I've seen a lot of my fellow colleagues that didn't vote for the bill show up at the ribbon cuttings. There doesn't seem to be any compulsion there. Look, I'm a glass full kind of guy. I'm an optimist by nature. I think that, when you have a disappointment and something doesn't happen, you just go back to work, and you address the shortcomings and you make it happen. This is a huge down payment. The biggest investment in infrastructure in some areas in our history, and in others in 20, 30 years. So, it's hard to look at it as the glass half empty when we got this done. But there's more to do. I mean, the point I tried to make tonight is that this will not catch up all the backlog. We still have more work to do. And I think, the American public needs to understand this is money well spent. This is an investment in our country, our country's infrastructure. This is what attracts people to our cities. This is what helps create jobs. And we're not talking, everybody thinks of infrastructure, roads and bridges. But we're talking broadband infrastructure. People don't understand how important that's going to be. And we have to think about the future, right? If we're going to have electric vehicles, we need to start to build an infrastructure to support the idea that we're going to have electric vehicles running around the country, which means you have to have charging stations. We're looking at these technologies that can help us deal with climate change, clean hydrogen and others. And these hydrogen hubs can be placed in areas like West Virginia, Western Pennsylvania, Eastern Ohio, that are going to replace some of the jobs being lost in the coal industry and other types of industries, where people can make a livable wage and support their families. This is the future. This is why Pittsburgh is part of the success story. We didn't sit around crying, when are the mills coming back? We pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps, and we started to look at other ways to bring jobs to our city. I chaired the robotics caucus because I knew how important that was going to be. And Jack Murtha, God rest his soul, and I were able to bring enough resources into Pittsburgh to form that robotics institute. And guess what? A lot of companies are in Pittsburgh now because of that. When you think about autonomous vehicles and AI and robotics, the companies that have come to Pittsburgh, they were attracted by institutions like that. University of Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon, Duquesne, all these universities are doing this federal research dollars that come in. These are investments in us, in the United States. Infrastructure can't go overseas. Infrastructure stays here in the United States. Everybody says, let's rebuild America. Let's do America first, America first. Well, the ultimate America first project is our infrastructure, okay? Those roads and bridges aren't going overseas. They're staying here. And guess who works on them? Americans work on them, and they make good wages. So to me, it should be a no-brainer, and it shouldn't be partisan. It never was partisan, by the way. The last infrastructure bill was done by Bud Schuster, who is, I'm told, just celebrated his 90th birthday. And some people may not remember Bud, but he grew up in the Mon Valley, grew up in Glassport, and he was chairman of the Transportation Committee under Newt Gingrich. So this was during a Republican administration. And he challenged Gingrich to do a transportation bill. And Gingrich said, you don't want to spend the money. And he said, you have to show me you have the votes to do that. And I was a young member of Congress when the phone rang one day, and it was Bud Schuster on the phone. And he said, Mike, I need your vote for a transportation bill. And I said, Mr. Chairman, what do I tell my constituents back in Pittsburgh? And he said, you tell them you've got $25 million worth of projects in the bill. And I said, Mr. Chairman, you have my vote. And we passed a transportation bill. Democrats and Republicans voted to pass that bill against the objection of the speaker. But that's the last time we did a bill, which was that many years ago. And it's taken us all this time to finally get a bipartisan bill and passed, even though it wasn't as big as we like. We passed what we could. And the president signed it. In the next 5 years, you're going to see a lot of results from that.
That's great. And I need to get a plug in and say that Bud Schuster was a distinguished graduate of the University of Pittsburgh who was particularly proud of the fact that his name is engraved in the walk between the Cathedral of Learning and Heinz Chapel as the outstanding student leader of his graduating class. So we had a Pitt guy getting a Penn State guy's vote on that.
Well, I can tell you that the Bud Schuster Highway made it a lot easier trip driving up to Penn State from them old roads we used to drive on. So we're probably fond of them for that reason too. And then his son, I served with Bud and his son Bill in Congress, and Bill just recently retired last session. So
I have some questions here for you that are much more general. Let me put a couple to you this way. Looking back on your 28 years, can you identify a particular high point and a particular low point in your efforts to move things forward for the greater good?
You know, when I think about what I'm most proud of, I've lived in my district my entire life. So this August, I'll be celebrating my 69th birthday. So for 69 years, I've lived in this district. And growing up as a kid, I remember we were a one-horse steel town. And I remember vividly the 70s and when the mills started to falter. And, you know, my dad worked at Edgar Thompson Steel Mill in Braddock, and my grandfather worked at the Cary Furnace in Rankin. So I grew up in a family of steel workers. I worked 2 summers at J&L when I was a student at Penn State, which convinced me to go back to college because that was tough work back then. But when you saw the pain and displacement that was caused when the steel industry collapsed, you know, Pittsburgh's now a very diverse economy. And there's no one industry in our city now that can cause that kind of economic hardship that occurred when the steel industry collapsed. And so I was determined when I got to Congress that we were going to work to diversify this economy and use some of the real bright spots we had. We had, you know, these wonderful academic centers in Pittsburgh. We had an academic medical center too. We had a foundation community that was active. And we created this partnership, you know, between government and the private sector and academia and the foundation communities to start to identify where we could have growth and how we could move certain programs forward. And so one of the things I'm really proud of is I got to play a small part in this transformation that's taken place over the last 28 years. And Pittsburgh's a much different city than the one I grew up in. I have 4 grown children. Guess what? They all found jobs in Pittsburgh. They all bought homes in Pittsburgh. I have 2 grandchildren. They live in Pittsburgh. I remember a time when that wasn't so. People were coming out of our colleges and they couldn't find jobs in Pittsburgh. They had to move. So to see that change and to see Allegheny County in the most recent census gain population, and to see when you look at the demographic, that 18 to 30 demographic is the one that's growing, that's to me, you know, I can look back over the 28 years and see the groundwork that we laid doing different things that helped that occur. So I'm quite proud of that. And I feel that, you know, Pittsburgh's a better place. Now, we still have work to do. Anyone that thinks we're done, it doesn't know Pittsburgh. There are still lots of areas that need help. I look at my district down through the Mon Valley and certain parts of the city. I see this housing bubble that's starting to develop, and we need more affordable housing here. You know, we still have some challenges, obviously, as a city, but a lot's been done. And secondly, Mark, I'd say founding the Autism Caucus, while I didn't personally have a family member with autism, I came to know some families that were struggling with that had children that were autistic. And I got a chance to learn about that a little bit when I worked in the Pennsylvania State Senate as a staffer. And so when I went to Congress, I was on the Veterans Committee, and I bumped into a Republican from New Jersey, Chris Smith. And just coincidentally, one day, we were talking about that, and he was saying how in Brick Township, New Jersey, he had the spike in autism, and they thought it had something to do with the environment there. And that's when we decided to form the caucus 21 years ago. Back then, NIH was only providing $10 million in funding for research into autism. Today, it's hundreds of millions of dollars. And we've got programs that coming out of the federal government to aid families that have autistic kids. So it's not just research now, it's also, there's a lot of, autism isn't killing people, and it's a spectrum, right? From very functional, Asperger's side of the spectrum, all the way to profoundly autistic, where some need to be institutionalized. And that to see the growth in the attention. My idea of autism initially was the Rain Man. I saw the movie The Rain Man, and I think a lot of people didn't know what it was, and it was misdiagnosed a lot. So I'm proud of the work that the Autism Caucus has done over the 21 years that Chris Smith and I have chaired it. And I think that's been a good thing too. So just watching my city change and evolve and transform, and seeing young people staying here and going out and seeing all the crowds at night, going into the restaurants, and just to see the vibrancy of the city just makes me feel so good. And like I said, I got to play a small part in that.
Well, that's self-effacing. You played a big role. So we're glad you're happy. We're glad you're proud. We're glad you're here with us today. And I do want to thank you both for delivering this lecture for us and for all that you've been doing for the last 28 years and really going back before that. It has made a real difference in this region.
Well, thanks, Mark. I appreciate that. And I appreciate our friendship. And I'll probably see you at the Giant Eagle one of these days.